Welcome to the class video for Module 8. In this module, we're going to look at a collection of documents, two versions of state constitutions that were written during the American Revolution, one from Pennsylvania in 1776 and the other from New York in 1777. And then we're going to turn and look at the Articles of Confederation, the first model of a national organization, but not, as we'll emphasize when we get to it, a constitution that creates a sovereign government. And that the Articles does not do so is fundamental to understanding the conceptual models being organized in this period. In order to understand just how radically democratic are these new American state constitutions, we need to set them in historical context by looking at the colonial charters and the structure of the governments that were created under those charters. We'll look briefly at the different methods that different states use to arrive at a constitution or some version thereof. And then we'll turn to the text, and we're going to divide the text into two groups. First, we'll compare Pennsylvania and New York's constitutions, and then we'll turn and look at the Articles of Confederation. Your assignment for this module is to read the Pennsylvania and New York constitutions and the Articles of Confederation, to take the Revolutionary Constitutions reading quiz, and as always to be looking for passages to build your final paper. You should find in many instances, depending on what clause you're working on in the federal constitution, but a great many of them will have direct analogs in one of the state constitutions or the articles document. And in some instances, if there is no analog in the revolutionary constitutions, that could itself be conceptually significant for your paper. So this is a great week to dive in and to be looking for passages to build your textual genealogy. Okay, let's turn now and think a little bit about the 150-year history or so of the colonial charters and the way in which they set up a model in which the new American revolutionaries are going to be thinking as they go to create their state constitutions. If you recall from our discussion in Module 6 on the historical background to John Dickinson's writings, there were really two ways that a British colonist could think about the constitutional structure of the empire in the 18th century. One way, which was Dickinson's primary focus, and in a more general way Paine's as well, was upon the Acts of Trade or the Navigation Acts, that is, those laws that govern the trade relationships, the economic relationships between the imperial center and the colonies. The other way of thinking about the constitutional structure of the empire is to think about the powers granted through the colonial charters upon each colony to govern the territory of the colony and the British subjects who lived in that territory. We do not hear much, or we really didn't hear anything about the colonial charters in either Dickinson or Paine. And if you recall the Declaration of Independence, there's no particular argument about claiming rights under the colonial charters, because of course that argument is an argument for British rights. That is, claiming the protections as British subjects under the British Constitution to certain protections. As the revolutionary movement becomes more radicalized, as it becomes increasingly about separation from Great Britain and the creation of a new American system, then the arguments, the claims based on colonial charters are less useful because, of course, they are a claim to a British rights. The British created the colonial charters. But in fact, over the 150-year history leading up to the 1760s, it would have been one of the most common ways for colonists to frame their arguments or their complaints against any particular act of the king or parliament. There are many, many disputes among all the different colonies over that century and a half. It was a pretty normal thing for the colonists to appeal and object to different things that Parliament or the king would do. And the most common way for them to present their complaints would be to argue that whatever the king or Parliament is doing is an infringement on the rights of government that are embedded in the colonial charters. So the colonial charters are a kind of prototype of constitution. They just don't have the kind of argumentative or rhetorical usefulness when you're trying to declare independence from the mother country. Now, just like we observed with the Acts of Trade, the British Empire was highly unique and well ahead of the other European states in conceiving of its empire as a system of trade relationships. So too the British Empire is very unique, idiosyncratic in using these colonial charters, especially in the early period in North America or in the Western Hemisphere, because the charters convey a sense of private ownership, especially in the early phase. The first two colonies organized in North America you are familiar with, the colony of Virginia and the colony of Massachusetts, are both organized essentially, at least in their legal form, as for-profit corporations. That is to say, especially in Virginia, a group of investors got together and they thought, well, those Spanish and Portuguese are making a bunch of money going over to the New World and stealing gold and silver and whatnot and bringing them back to Europe. We also want to have a group of what they call a group of adventurers to try their luck to see if they can make profit in the New World. And so a group of investors appealed to King James I and asked for permission to be formed together as what was called a joint stock company, which is really the early modern prototype of the modern corporation. It creates a legal entity, just like a corporation. It gives that entity the power or the legal right to sell shares, kind of like a stock market, and then to take those proceeds from selling those shares, go into business, and redistribute the profits to their shareholders. And it creates that as a legal enterprise. Now, we think less of Massachusetts as a for-profit venture. Our image of early colonial Massachusetts is these religious dissenters, these Puritans who are fleeing Great Britain to create a New Jerusalem in the New World. But in their legal organization, the Puritan immigrants organized themselves as the Massachusetts Bay Company. And even though they weren't particularly motivated by profit, that is, to come and steal the riches of the New World and take it back to Europe to sell and make money off of it, they did and were interested in having the legal autonomy to make their own rules for themselves in the New World, to be a governing institution over themselves. And so they presented themselves, this would have been to Charles I, as a group of economic or business adventurers who wanted to create this joint stock company, essentially to colonize the northern half of the North American coastline, where the Virginia Bay Company was responsible for exploiting the resources of the southern half. Having gotten their charter from the king, then they go off and they're not particularly interested in money making or returning dividends to their investors. Their investors invest in the Massachusetts Bay Company because they want to support the enterprise of having an area for religious dissenters, for these Puritans to be able to settle. Nevertheless, they take the legal form of a kind of prototype of a corporation. So this early model of how to organize colonization has this weird combination of both individualism, individual for-profit, right, entrepreneurship, profit-seeking, but also is an extension of state power. That is, it is the power of the king to create this legal entity called the joint stock company. If the king did not write the piece of paper and put his signature on it, the Virginia Bay Company or the Massachusetts Bay Company would have no legal authority to enter into contracts or to give rules to the settlers there and whatnot. So it's a combination of private individuals putting their own property at risk and adventuring for their own profit, but also doing so on behalf of the state authority. It's this weird amalgam which is so different than the other European powers. Now that joint stock company charter form, that kind of legal document or legal form within which these colonial governments were created, is going to go through two important changes or evolutions. The first is that the initial creation of the joint stock company charter gets applied to these things called proprietorships. And the first two proprietorships are before the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period. That is, New Hampshire is created in 1622, primarily because of the great old pine forests up in New England and New Hampshire, and the British Navy wanted to claim the right to all those old growth trees for masts and lumber for building of the British Navy. So the British Navy essentially wanted to set aside those old forests, and they create a proprietorship. This guy, John Mason, gets the official contract to provide all the lumber for the British Navy. And then you know the story of Maryland. The Lord Calvert is a Catholic, and King Charles in 1632 creates a haven for Catholics who feel persecuted in England, and that's where Maryland comes from. Those are the first two proprietorships, but really the model or form of the proprietorship comes after 1660 with the restoration of the Stuarts, if you remember that story, and the restoration of Charles II to the throne. Charles II, while he was in exile during the Commonwealth period, has a number of rich English lords who remain loyal to the Stuart family while they're out of power. When Charles comes back to the throne, he wants to reward those friends of the family. And essentially what he does is take a map of North America and start subdividing both Virginia and Massachusetts, creating more colonies out of those big colonies, and then handing those colonies to his friends, those rich noblemen who had remained loyal to the Stuart family. So we get a whole series of what are called the proprietorships. Carolina in 1663, which is given to a group of 8 lords. Ultimately, Carolina will be subdivided in 1712 between North and South. East and West Jersey, which will be formed together in as one Jersey, New Jersey, in 1702. New York in 1664. And Pennsylvania, of course, in 1681, followed by Delaware in 1682, granted to Lord William Penn. Now here we have essentially the same legal form. We create this thing called a joint stock company, but with essentially one person at its charge, or 8 lord proprietors in the case of Carolina. And actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, John Locke was one of those lord proprietors in that first grant of Carolina. But these proprietorships is a single individual or family, the Duke of York or Lord Penn, who is the absolute lord and master, essentially the owner of all the land within that colony. So William Penn is essentially legally the owner of all the land within the territory of Pennsylvania, and it's his right to bestow that ownership upon claimants, that is, settlers who come in and stake a claim to the land. They have to buy that land essentially from William Penn. Yet there is this great irony, too, of which Pennsylvania is the best example. You may have heard of the frame of government that William Penn wrote for his colony of Pennsylvania, which is, now we're talking about the 1680s, one of the most radically democratic and especially religiously tolerant code of laws anywhere in the world since the ancient world. William Penn's frame of laws welcomed any religious believer who recognized the true one God. That is to say, not only all Christians, that is Catholics as well as every variety of Protestant, but in principle too, Jewish people and Muslim people as well would have been permissible within Penn's frame of laws. And for the 17th century, that is astoundingly tolerant and open-minded. So there's this strange influx or strange paradox, if you will. You have these absolute rulers and masters who could have the most dictatorial, totalitarian laws if they wanted to, but they get into a kind of competition with each other to see who can write the most enlightened and progressive constitution. John Locke, in fact, wrote the model constitution for Carolina in, I believe it was the early 1680s, shortly before the Glorious Revolution. And again, you see the extension of the principle of voting, at least to property holders, embedded rights around property, and at least a degree, though less than in the Penn's frame of government, an extension of religious toleration, at least to all Christians, that is, Catholics as well as every variety of Protestant. So these Lord Proprietors are a kind of strange group. They are enlightened political thinkers who are trying to create progressive frames of government, but the constitutional theory behind a proprietorship is the absolute rule of one man, very medieval or feudal in its legal or sovereign structure or conceptualization. The final change, then, that these charters go through is they become gradually royalized over the end of the 17th century and especially in the early first quarter of the 18th century. The model of this happens right away with Virginia. The King James, was content to have these private adventurers go out and lose their shirts or make some money if they could. But once he saw that Virginia was going to start producing tobacco, and tobacco would be a regular crop that could be taxed, then James became very interested in owning Virginia himself, that is, having direct control over the crops that came out of the colony. So very early, the private charter of the Virginia Bay Company is revoked, and James issues a royal charter. For the other colonies, though, it tends to happen in spate around conflicts with the colonies. So when these colonies rise up and protest, we have a charter, we have certain colonial rights, a common outcome of those disputes is you end up getting your charter taken away, and the king issues you another one that's directly from the royal authority and makes no pretense to you having any independent authority to make laws outside of his purview. So that by the first quarter or so of the 18th century, every colonial charter, with the exception of Pennsylvania's, has been royalized. As they get taken over by royal authority and more directly under the control of the king, then their governmental systems become more standardized. And that's the story of the first half of the 18th century, is the slow transformation, the kind of eccentric and different models of how each colony might rule itself become homogenized and much more similar to one another over the course of the first half of the 18th century. By 1750 or so, that is the period before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War and everything blowing up into a revolution, each colony would have evolved a roughly analogous structure of government. And the basic idea was that just as the British government had the three essential Aristotelian parts, the one, the few, and the many, in the form of the king, the lords, and the commons, so too each colony, in order to have a valid, legitimate government, should incorporate those same three components, the one, the few, and the many. And what held the empire together, what made it an empire, is that each of the colonies and Great Britain shared the same one, the same king. And so the way that worked in practice is each colony would have roughly a governor, council, and assembly. The governor representing the one, the council representing the few, and the assembly representing the many. Again, these go under slightly different names in the different colonies, but would have the same fundamental structure. The key to the system is that the governor is appointed by the king and serves at the king's pleasure. The governor does not represent the people of New York or the people of Massachusetts or the people of Virginia. The governor is an employee of the king and is in the colony in order to carry out the king's orders. Now, there are scores and scores of colonial governors over the 150, 170 years leading up to the American Revolution. They are every manner of person and example you could think of. Some governors get hired by the king, they move to, say, Virginia, and they essentially become Virginians. They come to identify with the colony that they live in. They may serve for 20 or 30 years and die in their old age and be a hallowed, celebrated governor. On the other hand, there are governors that come over and treat it like a rung on the climbing the ladder of the imperial hierarchy. And they might come and serve for a year or two or three, get an opportunity for a better post and take it, or maybe get into an argument with the colonists that they can't resolve, so the king recalls that governor and ships out another one. The governor, in other words, may serve for any number of years, from a very short period, just a few years, to decades and anywhere in between there. Understanding that variation, then, that the governor can serve any number of years, helps explain how the other parts of the constitutions work, or the governments work. When a new governor arrives, the legal rationale is when the old governor left, the government was dissolved. When the new governor arrives, he creates a new governor. And he does that by establishing these two other bodies, the council and the assembly. Now, for the council, typically anywhere from, say, 6 or 8 up to 15 or 20 people get to serve on the council. They are generally the wealthiest, most influential men in the colony, and the governor gets to appoint them to his colony, to his council. So a new governor arrives, he has, say, a dozen council posts to give away, which are positions of influence and respect. Typically, the governor will hold big gala parties, go around, visit the colonists, find out who the most influential people are, and essentially try to buy them off into his side to supporting whatever the king has told him to come implement in the colonies. He can pick the richest guys in the colonies and offer them a seat on the council. They will serve on the council for as long as the governor serves in office, unless the governor dismisses them, right? So they have the same tenure of office as the governor. When the governor gets recalled or passes away or moves on to another job, then the council is dissolved and a new governor will come in and appoint a new council. So too with the assembly. When the governor comes in, the old assembly is sent home and dissolved, and there the governor then will hold elections to elect a new assembly. Who gets to vote is highly variable from one colony to the other. In some colonies, you have to be very, very rich to have the right to vote. In other colonies, sort of the lowest standard is generally you have to own your own land, right, outright. We'll talk more about that when we get to voting rights, when we look at the New York and Pennsylvania constitutions. So the key thing there is that, yes, the assembly is elected, but it's not on any regular schedule. That is to say, there are no rules that say, Congress serves for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, we'll hold elections and elect a new crew in. It is entirely random when elections happen. They might happen 1 year, and then the governor gets fired 2 years later, and you get to have more elections 2 years later. It might be 30 years before you hold another set of elections to elect a new assembly. So elections are very special. It's like a holiday. It's a sacred event when you get to hold election, but they're nothing like the foundation from which all governmental authority flows, right? They are not necessary to create sovereignty in this scheme. Election day is more like Mardi Gras or Carnival. It's sort of the world turned upside down and the people get to come out and express their opinion. It's a very rare and special thing when you hold an election. It is not the routine foundation by which the people offer their consent to the laws that are being imposed on them. And elections have even less to do when you get down below the level of the colonial government and look at the local governments, which is where the vast majority of ordinary people's interaction with the law would occur. The two most important offices in colonial local government, that is at the village or the town or out in a rural district, what we call counties or parishes, depending on the colony. These two officers, one called the Justice of the Peace and the other called the Vestryman. The justices of the peace are sort of like a sheriff and a county court judge all rolled into one. Men get appointed as justices of the peace primarily by the governor, nominated by the current justices in their area. Once you get appointed as a justice of the peace, you serve for life. It's a qualification, and anywhere you go, whether you're in your home county or if you pick up with your family and move out to the Western Territories and arrive in a brand new county where nobody's ever heard of you before, you would still be a justice of the peace. You've had that legal authority bestowed on you. In any given town or city or rural county, the justices of the peace get together. It looks more like kind of a county court in rural areas. It looks more like a city council when you're in towns and villages. Kind of the town elders get together. They are the court, and they have broad political authority. That is, they can impose taxes. The vast majority of taxes, if you were an ordinary farmer, that you would pay would not be the taxes on the crops that you sent to Great Britain. Most of them would be your local county taxes that were passed in order to help build the roads and help do everyday things around your village. That would have been where most of your taxes came from or went to. And the authority that imposed that would be your county court, your county justices. They were not elected. There is no principle of consent there. The justices of the peace hear legal cases, that is, minor crimes, things like murder or kidnapping might well get sent to the general colonial court, but ordinary crimes of like theft and fraud and things like that would have been heard by the local county court. The local county court, or these justices of the peace, are in control of the local militia. They would be essentially the officer corps that would be empowered to ordering the militia out to, say, protect the frontier from Native American attacks or whatnot. All of this governmental authority would have been acted upon individuals without any sense that those people were illegitimate because they hadn't been elected. The vestrymen play a very similar role, but primarily over religious authority. That is, the vestrymen tend to be the elders or the church council that then have authority over what they would have called morals and welfare. That is, say, adultery, incest, abortion, any of those kind of private sexual family matters. And also indigents and people who could not take care of themselves, people who are either handicapped or just poor, would have been turned over to the vestrymen. And similarly, the vestrymen typically get nominated by current vestrymen, that is, those who sit on the vestry, nominate someone to be added to their board. You send off that nomination to the governor, who confirms it, and if the governor does confirm it, then that person is a vestryman for life. And not just because they sit on their particular board. If they were to pack up with their family and move to another colony, they would be vestrymen when they arrive because they've had that authority confirmed on them. So here, similarly, if you get accused of adultery with the neighbor's wife, the vestrymen can come and arrest you. They can have a hearing. They can decide that you're guilty. They can whip you. They can force you to support the child of this other person if they decide you're the father. All of that authority without any reference to any kind of constitutional scheme that requires elections. So the thing to take away from this governmental model is to see how rare and unique elections are with a tiny, you don't want to call it insignificant role because they're very important conceptually or ideologically. The colonists celebrate their power to hold elections, but if you look at how governmental power actually operated in their lives, it was a very small element of governmental control. Certainly nothing like what we're about to turn to and see in these revolutionary state constitutions, where all governmental authority must necessarily flow from the consent of the people as expressed through elections. And so there is a radical, profoundly radical change in the governments that are being proposed here in the 1760s compared to certainly what the colonists themselves had known over the previous nearly 200 years by 1776, and virtually anything else in Western history, at least going back to the ancient Greek city-states. There just is nothing comparable to what we're going to look at here in the revolutionary state constitutions. we want to look at one more piece of where these radical new state constitutions come from. That is the process of ratification, drafting, proposal, and ratification during the revolution itself. Now we have a kind of conventional model of how creating a constitution is supposed to go based on the federal experience in 1787, 1788. That is to say, we Americans expect to see first a convention, that is a separate meeting, separate elections and delegations to a distinct meeting solely for the purpose of drafting the Constitution. And then the process of ratification, which we hope, like the federal model, is then that convention adjourns, publishes the proposed Constitution to the people, whoever it is that has the credentials to vote, and those people then have a chance to vote on it, whether they accept it or not. This is the process by which the federal Constitution was ratified and will come thereafter to be accepted as the kind of normal choreography, but it was not at all, or only in some instances, the process used during the revolution itself. That two-step process, convention and ratification, and then as a separate thing, the execution of the government, or the bringing the government into power, corresponds to, if you recall, both in Locke and in Rousseau, that necessity of a first agreement. And that was implied in Locke when he described the social contract and he described those two different numerical thresholds. Remember, he says that first agreement only binds those people who agree to it, but every agreement thereafter, the majority can bind the minority. And Rousseau also says, if you recall, that the principle of majority vote presupposes unanimity on at least one prior occasion. So the convention process choreographs or ritualizes, if you will, that unique moment of deciding on the rules of the game, right, or the social contract. Once the social contract or the Constitution has been agreed upon, then we go into normal operations underneath that Constitution. But the convention signifies the unique moment in history of the drafting of a new Constitution. Now, indeed, only 4 states, that is Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, actually during the revolution went through both of those steps. That is to say, they elected a convention solely for the purpose of drafting the Constitution. That convention then, when it had finished its work, dissolved, and it published its work or its draft Constitution to the people. But there were many other models that the states followed. At least as common as the convention model is that the sitting legislature itself simply sat and drafted a constitution and either submitted for ratification or, just as likely, simply approved it under its own authority. So we see that in New Hampshire and Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Jersey and Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, it was simply the sitting legislature that adopted the Constitution. Now, conceptually, that raises the same problem that we've referred to with 1688 and the Glorious Revolution and Parliament's choice to simply pass a series of statutes in the aftermath of 1688 and to declare in those statutes, these are fundamental laws that shall be considered part of the Constitution. Well, what unique process? That is to say, if it was Parliament that had the authority to bring this law into force, why couldn't a subsequent Parliament negate that law and take it out of force? It was the same governmental authority. And if that's true, then what makes that law, in what sense is that law a higher law that binds the legislature itself? With the adoption of the convention, then you at least have this kind of mythology, this kind of ritualized choreography in which subsequent sitting legislatures cannot claim to have the authority to rewrite the Constitution. It was this unique kind of mystical body, this convention thing, that came into being it drafted the Constitution and bestowed it upon us, and then it went out of existence. That thing doesn't exist anymore, and so the Constitution can only be changed by again calling a Constitution into existence. So we are going to look at two examples from New York and Pennsylvania of the states going through what we now consider to be kind of the classic formula for how you generate a constitution. But indeed what's going to happen is we're going to go through the process of these state constitutions and the federal constitution. After the federal constitution is ratified, that process will come to seem conventional, and the other states will gradually kind of mold themselves around it. So you see all of these, or many of these states that did not have a convention during the Revolution, later in the 19th century, especially as we get to the Jacksonian period in the 18-teens and the 1820s, the 1830s and the 1840s, there will be increasing pressure on those states then to go back to a convention and to re-ratify their constitution in the middle of the 19th century. The important thing to take away from this experience, and when you see the diversity of paths that the different states took towards a constitutional order, is to see the enormous diversity and experimentation. There's a kind of hothouse of experimentation going on in these 6, 7, 8 years between the Declaration of Independence and the calling of the Federal Convention in 1787. There are a dozen or more constitutions or drafts of constitutions that are floating around. The delegates that are sitting in these different state assemblies and state conventions are writing letters to each other and describing, well, this is how we're shaping the Senate down here in Delaware. What are you guys doing up there in Massachusetts? What is your Senate like? And there is a kind of enormous collaborative effort, but no particular preordained form for what these things have to look like. Every kind of weird facet of a constitution you might imagine writing into one probably appears somewhere in one of these constitutions, at least in a draft form or a debate at some point over the course of this decade or so. The New York Constitution, which we'll look at, really becomes a kind of orthodox center, a middle or a moderate example of all these different experimentations. The Pennsylvania Constitution, primarily through its unicameral legislature or single house of the legislature, sort of stands as an emblem of the radically egalitarian fringe of all of these constitutions. But it is a dynamic and evolutionary process, and the framers of these constitutions are writing back and forth and debating back and forth, and the constitutions are constantly changing and adapting as the debate moves forward. So we don't want to come to these two state constitutions and imagine they were sort of chiseled on a stone tablet at the top of the mountain and brought down to the people to bow down in awe before them. Rather, you want to think of a kind of ferment, if you will, a kind of bubbling of intellectual energy over these 10 years, and a great range of possibilities falling out of these experiments that are slowly then going to be, through experience in the latter part of the decade, consolidated into what we imagine as the conventional model as expressed in the federal Constitution. So let's leave the historical context there and turn in the next segment of the class to looking at the texts of the New York and Pennsylvania constitutions.